Go. Welcome everybody to Pardot Consultant 7 Days Bootcamp. Me and Payal welcome you on behalf of Pardot New Delhi and Pardot Ajmer Group. I'm sure you all are very excited. Thanks again for joining us. Thank you, Ben, for being here. I welcome you on behalf of both the groups. I hope you're doing good and safe. The stage is all yours.
All right. Well, thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to present to the group here. I'm really excited about it, and I've spent some time working on this presentation, and my kind of approach to this is going to be to look at the requirements, what's outlined in the actual exam guide, but also going to kind of borrow on some of the experiences that I've had, things that maybe are not necessarily called out explicitly in the exam guide, but are things that are good to know, recommendations, things that as a consultant that you are likely to encounter. So my name is Ben Lamothe. I'm a Pardot solutions architect with Demand Gen, which is a marketing automation agency and Salesforce partner. I'm a 5-time certified Salesforce. I'm also a marketing champion, and I lead. You can't see my screen. Can you guys see my screen okay? No? There we go. I wasn't sharing my screen. Jeez. My bad, everybody. Sorry. Anyway, so yeah. Sorry about that. So yeah, my name is Ben Lamothe, solutions architect at Demand Gen, 5X Salesforce certified, also part of the Marketing Champions program, and I lead the Tampa Pardot user group here in Tampa. And like I said before, I'm going to be kind of trying to hem closely to the exam guide, but also kind of sprinkle in some things that as a consultant, I don't necessarily know that these are going to be on the exam, but the exam has changed since I've taken it. But things that things absolutely to know as a consultant working specifically on Pardot. So obviously the first part here is around account config. So the first section is account config. This is the actual material that is going to be part of these. These are the 3 things that are on the that are in the exam guide. These are the 3 things that they outline for the specific account config around technical setup, things like that. And these are the 3 items that I'll be touching on. So the first thing that I want to touch on when it comes to account config is the Pardot Lightning app deployment process. As a Pardot specialist or somebody who's just working in Pardot and happens to know Pardot really well, but that's one set of skills. But the other set of skills to keep in mind is the actual setup and the maintenance and the editing and configuration of the app itself in Salesforce Lightning. These are 2 things that are very important. Once you've actually installed the app in Lightning, there are things here that you need to keep in mind. It's when you're creating new users, is the ability to select the correct permission sets in Salesforce to ensure that they have the ability to access the Pardot app in Lightning. And so it's either going to be the CRM user or the Sales Cloud user that you need to add the permission sets for. And then the second step to that is there's another app called the B2BMA Canvas. And to be able to actually see anything in the Lightning app, this has to be configured as well to ensure that they have access. And you do that at the permission set level. So you need to take whatever permission sets are for the users and make sure that those permission sets are also set up here on the B2BMA Canvas for the Lightning connected app. Without these steps, it's not possible for someone to be able to access the Pardot app. And as a Pardot specialist who's in the app every day, that's just, this wouldn't necessarily fall within your area of responsibility typically. But if you are, as a consultant, and you have a client and you say, hey, I need to create new users, this is the steps that you have to follow. Is you have to create those users, give them the correct permission sets, enable them within the, and also give them permissions on the B2BMA Canvas app. There is another step here that is important, and it's the technical setup around the Lightning app. You are able to, it's important to be able to access to know how to access the Lightning app, to be able to get into the app builder, to make changes and to change things like the navigation items, which is what I have highlighted here. Something that often comes up that I tend to have to edit for clients is the ability to, is adding what's called adding a navigation item called Pardot campaigns, because it doesn't, when you install the app out of the box, the only tab here is the Salesforce campaigns, and that's because of Connected campaigns. But if you want to be able to access things like tracking codes, you need to have the Pardot campaigns tab here as well. And so in order to be able to do that, you need to make sure that you have selected that navigation item. The second thing that is important on this, well, all of these are important, but really the two that I tend to have the most use of as a consultant is the user profiles. The user profiles item here is what dictates someone's ability to actually view the app in their app launcher. So you have to click user profiles and then ensure that the correct profiles for the right people are selected to be visible or active. If it's not selected to be active, then they won't be able to access the app in their app launcher. Even if you've given them Sales Cloud access, Sales Cloud or CRM user, if the Sales Cloud or CRM user is not a user profile that's set to visible here, then they won't be able to see it. So these are all things that are going to go into successfully deploying and managing the Lightning app beyond just hitting an install. If you have to add users, if you have to change up the navigation, all these things are kind of standard information for a consultant. And I don't know if this will be on the exam. I have not seen the exam material recently, but knowing that this is something that as a consultant I encounter, even if it's not on the exam, these are things that I would strongly recommend having a degree of familiarity with. The next item here is also something that I've encountered actually somewhat recently around tab visibility. I've had users magically have their tabs disappear when they go to the Pardot app. Being able to jump in and update tab visibility is important. So just because they have the Pardot Lightning app does not necessarily mean that they are always going to have access to the right tabs. I showed you the tab visibility, selecting the tabs of the previous one here on the previous slide, but there's also things I've had people, whether there's been a security update or there's been something that's changed with that profile, if you are, sometimes those will disappear. I've had that happen to several clients of mine, and you have to go in and manually select the right tabs to go from default off to default on for every profile that's affected. So knowing how to get into tab visibility and on the profile section is also going to be important, because otherwise people may find themselves wondering, why can I only see 2 tabs? And as a consultant, they're going to look to you to say, oh, hang on, let me go into the profiles and make sure that all your tabs are correctly set up, because these things do disappear, and it can be kind of a panic-inducing moment if you're not really sure how to bring them back. And so this does require obviously a little bit of Salesforce knowledge around access and tab visibility and things of that nature. All right, so now we're going to kind of get into the more kind of in-app technical setup. So I've highlighted a few different things here. Setting up tracker domains is one of the key elements of managing the technical setup here. And so you see here that I've got in this sample, I've got several domains. It's possible, obviously, to set up several domains. As a consultant, you need to be familiar with the pros and cons of all of these, and ensuring that you have set up, that you have a primary domain set up, and that they've all been validated. You have to be familiar with how to communicate with the member of IT to set up these tracker domains, to know what you need to tell them, what the codes are that you need to tell them. Having a degree of familiarity with DNS management and setup will help you here, because you can tell them, hey, I need you to go into the DNS for this domain and add a CNAME record with this code, with this validation key. They'll be able to kind of take what you said and implement correctly. The other thing here that's important is SSL and HTTPS. Pardot has taken steps to increase the level of security, and been very encouraging to people, to customers, to get on that train. Setting up SSL and HTTPS is fairly straightforward. And it's something that, as you have a client, let's say you inherit a client that's on an older version, there may be some visibility issues. If you have a if the website is, if there's a website that's HTTPS, but all your assets are just HTTP, that introduces some security challenges and potentially some visibility issues. If it's not going to, if an HTTPS website won't display an HTTP image or anything like that, ensuring that all your domains are set to HTTPS with SSL is going to give you the right perspective and the right setup for your clients, and will give you the highest level of security really available, and prevent any cross domain media display issues. So again, you can add as many domains as you want. I think there's a limit, but it's in, like, I feel like it's in the hundreds. I'm not totally sure. You can check on that. But remember that each of them require their own technical setup, and make sure to go behind and enable SSL with HTTPS. You can also delete these if you want. That comes with its own set of hazards, but yes, this. So you would set up a tracker domain here, using just to literally create it, and then make sure that you pass the validation key on to the right person in the IT department who has access to the DNS record for that specific domain. This is something that I would not be surprised if it came up on the exam. This is relatively new. So this is around tracking alignment. So, and this kind of gets to a little bit what I was talking about before, where Pardot introduced a first-party tracking, a first-party. It was a limited. It was a limited release, and I think now it's fully available. And so, being familiar with things like this is going to be important. And what this does is, so in this example, because the web user is interactive with 3 sites. One site has a configuration that does not maintain first-party context because the website and entire top-level domain +1 do not align. So in this example, the tracker domain here for visitor 1 is go.firstbrand.com, and the actual website, the actual user, is visiting firstbrand.com. That's meant to be in alignment. So if you then have a visitor who visits an asset or uses an asset that's go.secondbrand.com, but they're on firstbrand.com website, or they're on go.firstbrand, that creates cross-domain issues. And it becomes difficult to then identify first-party context. So the takeaway here is to ensure that, and I'll get into this a little bit later, but when you are, for example, when you have a tracking code on a website, and you have assets on that web page, it's important to ensure that everything is in alignment. So you're using assets or using a domain, go.firstbrand.com, and that's aligned to the tracking code for firstbrand.com or go.firstbrand.com. Crossing domains introduces problems, introduces a lack of ability to do appropriate tracking. And as web security, as browser security has increased, this has become increasingly important. So I would recommend spending some time with first-party tracking, and that is managing that. This is a setting that is available. You don't have to do it. It is a when you go into settings, there is a checkbox where you can enable first-party tracking. It's recommended, but having a level of familiarity, because I could very easily see this being a question on the consultant exam around first-party tracking and any kind of asset visibility issues or tracking issues. So it'll ask you, and they may ask you, how do you remedy this, or what is the recommended audit to identify the issue, things of that nature. So being familiar with first-party tracking and the pros and cons is strongly recommended. There's a lot of information on the website on various. I mean, there's just a lot of blogs about it recently. So I would recommend looking into that. Next up on the technical setup is around email domains. And this is similar to the tracker domain. There is some requirements here that you need to communicate to a IT representative who has access to the DNS record. What I've done is I've clicked the expected DNS entries, and this is what needs to be communicated. Every time you create a email domain, this needs to be set up. There isn't like an automation. Something to remember is that as you create domains, this then gives you flexibility around sending email from a different company. So you have testcompany.com, and let's say then you create another email domain, newcompany.com. Companies will use this especially if they're running more than one brand out of their Pardot instance. And I can see this being a question on the Pardot consultant exam, asking how to manage a brand that has an organization that has several different brands, and they need to be able to email out of Pardot using those different email domains. How is that set up? And that's the foundation of that is here, setting up, doing the technical setup here for the email domains, and then making sure that you select the right domain when you're going into the email sending process. When you're selecting who you're going to send the email from, you now have that ability, because if you were to select a domain that isn't part of your technical setup here, then Pardot will throw an error. It'll tell you that you haven't validated that domain. So this is important, and every time you do this, you need to make sure that you send the right information for the SPF, the domain key policy, and the domain key, because each of these are going to be unique to that specific domain. And you can check your domains by clicking check DNS entries, and it will ping the DNS record to check that everything is in order. And if it is, then you'll get check boxes across the board that that's correct, or if it's not, then it'll say that it's not finding the SPF record or things of that nature. There are scenarios where there are companies that have multiple SPF records. for on a domain, and so there are ways to append your Pardot.spf to an existing SPF record. I would recommend digging into that a little bit. Make a note to look into that. I've had that happen where I've had clients who use that email domain for several other services, and they need to keep those SPF records in place, and you can't create another one. So you need to append Pardot to the SPF record. And I don't really go into detail here, but there are resources that exist that will walk you through that process. But that's a situation where I can see it on the exam of how company X needs to be able to add their update their SPF record, but they're using this email domain across several services. How do you remedy that? That's a situation where, as a consultant, that's a kind of consulting question. So that would be something that could potentially, if not on the exam, then certainly be a real life situation as a Pardot consultant that you would have to navigate. And you can, like I said, add several domains up here. There's even a filter if you've got a bunch of domains. There are enterprise accounts where you've got a bunch of domains on here. You can certainly add as many as you need. It can obviously get a little hairy the more you add. The next step here is around the Pardot tracking codes. This is for campaigns. And so assuming that you have connected campaigns set up, then your campaign creation obviously is going to start in Salesforce. Once you set up that campaign, it then becomes available in Pardot as a Pardot campaign. And you just need to make sure as you create campaigns that you add the tracking codes to the before the close body tag. Something that I do want to mention here is that, and I've seen it happen where clients will have a single kind of either like just one or two kind of base campaigns, and everything will get that. And how Pardot will work with first party is when someone visits a web page that has a Pardot tracking code and a Pardot form, the Pardot form does not get the first party, like the source campaign. It's the tracking code that assigns the first campaign. So, or the source campaign. So it's important to make sure to be diligent here, because otherwise you could have one campaign, and I've seen it. You could have one campaign that technically is the first touch campaign for every opportunity that's ever come through the website, even though there's been 25 different campaigns that have been run. They haven't been assigned unique tracking codes. And because of how Pardot manages their sourcing, it's the first touch is considered the website visit, not the form completion. So this is very important to remember, especially if you're running several campaigns, and these campaigns you want to measure first touch off of, especially for around connected campaigns, because of how connected campaigns works when it adds campaign members automatically. So to avoid this, make sure that you do have diversity in your tracking codes, in your tracking code settings for different web pages, because otherwise, if you have a global just a global tracking code and you don't make any changes beyond that, then any form completion on your website, regardless of campaign, is going to have the first touch of website tracking. And that means that 100% of any marketing revenue is technically attributed, if you're using first touch, is all attributed to this one random website tracking campaign, when it may not be accurate, when you may have a specific campaign that you actually need to assign that to, because you don't have that tracking code set up to be unique by campaign. It can create problems downstream. There is something else here that, as I mentioned previously, with the first party tracking, when you implement the first party tracking, you do need to then come back through all of your tracking codes and update them to reflect the correct domain. So you have the correct domain for the tracking code on the correct domain for the actual website that it's going to be sitting on, to ensure that first party, instead of having website A, but your tracking code says is technically listed to website B. It's intended to have this kind of consistency throughout. So you would need to if you do enable first party tracking, you will need to come through and update your tracking codes, and then also re-add them to your web pages to reflect the first party tracking. This is something else that is important, and I can imagine will come up. This is in the connector settings for the Pardot Lightning app. One of the things in here is called user sync, and what user sync does, in case you have not encountered it, is what it does is basically it dictates the creation and deletion of Pardot users from Salesforce. So as you create a new user, let's say just a John Doe, and John Doe is assigned with the let's say the marketing profile. If this box is checked for marketing profile, then John Doe will be created in Pardot automatically and will be assigned to the Pardot role of marketing. And then if John Doe then changes his profile changes from marketing profile to sales profile, then his profile in Pardot and his access in Pardot now changes from marketing to whatever you've set the sales profile equivalent to be in Pardot. This is something that is increasingly popular, but also requires a bit of management, because it's something that should be done with a bit of care, because if you were to opt into managing users in Salesforce, it's irreversible. You can't say, oh, never mind, don't want to do that anymore. So I would strongly recommend reviewing all the documentation and the pros and cons. But user sync is something that I can foresee, I can envision would end up on the exam, because of how prevalent it is, and because this is definitely something that falls within the parameters of something that a consultant might be asked to set up, and also explain to a client about the pros and the cons and things to consider. There's also settings. There's other settings where on the user sync you can set it up so that if somebody, let's say if John Doe has a sales profile and then he gets changed to support profile, but the support profile has not been mapped to a Pardot role. If that happens, then John Doe would get sent to the recycle bin in Pardot, because he's not mapped to an existing profile. So those are settings that you need to be aware of, you would be familiar with, and be able to communicate to somebody who can then either tell you what they'd like to do, or you can make a recommendation based on your understanding of their instance. So this is the Pardot Salesforce connector. This is something that you're going to want to be very familiar with. The pros, what it is, what's involved with it. And I've highlighted both the username here, which is the one that comes provisioned automatically once you set up connected campaigns. And then also here the different settings that exist, the pausing sync, which is part of the V2 connector. Some of you are probably familiar with the V1 versus V2 connector. The V2 connector enables the ability to pause the sync. Previously, the V1 connector was just a stop. So this is a pause and then a re-enable. You need to be familiar with. I would recommend being familiar with what sync metadata means. In this case, sync metadata is an option that will sync configuration level data. So if you create custom fields on the lead or contact object, you need those to come in to Pardot for the purposes of mapping. You don't need to do a full database sync. the sync metadata feature becomes pretty valuable. I've used it several times when I'm trying to do mapping kind of quickly, and I just need to make sure that everything is there and available. I just click sync metadata. You would typically click it when you want to sync fields for pick lists, but you don't want to do, like I said, a full database sync. The other things to be aware of is obviously the sync queue that tells you where people are in the database. And the big one that tends to get forgotten is the sync errors. This is something that Pardot does not send you a notification saying, hey, you've got 30,000 sync errors. You just happen to sometimes stumble upon it. Being familiar with sync errors, knowing how to resync prospect, that's a relatively new feature. I don't know that it'll be on the exam because of how new it is, but as a consultant, I would just be familiar with the new feature of being able to resync from the sync error table. And I would also recommend spending some time with sync errors around some of the more common errors that come through. This is very much something that falls in the parameters of a consultant, is diagnosing and remedying sync errors between Pardot and Salesforce. It can be kind of frustrating because they don't always give you a lot of information, but being familiar with how to manage, let's say, I mean, I can see a scenario where it says a client has, I don't know, let's say 10,000 sync errors. How do you remedy this? What is your recommended path for clearing the sync errors? And there are different ways that you can approach that. You can, if it's all like the same issue, then you can fix that issue and then resync it from the sync error table. But if it's different issues, that's a lot of people, you're probably going to want to make all those corrections and then export the sync errors to a CSV and then re-import them. And the re-import will trigger the sync between Pardot and Salesforce, and then should clear the sync errors. But it really just depends on the specific issues that are appearing in your sync errors in the connector. So going back to the connector here, be very familiar with the connector settings. This is obviously the current user, which is the BBMA integration user that comes automatically provisioned. You are able to change this, so be familiar with the pros and cons of doing this and what has to happen on the Salesforce side to enable this. There is a separate set of permission sets. If you were to want to use an actual user, you're going to want to be familiar with the permission sets that exist that need to be changed and given to this new connector user. I typically don't recommend changing away from this because it was created specifically for the Pardot Salesforce integration, and when you create an actual user, you introduce a lot of potential problems, especially when it comes to mapping people who may, especially if it's an actual user, if they were to leave the organization, you've got to kind of figure out now who's going to fill that spot. So be familiar with the pros and cons of the connector user, and also what has to happen in the event that you do need to move off of the connector user. The connector preferences here around this checkbox is, I run into this checkbox all the time because you'll have clients that won't want, or will want kind of shades of gray. They will say, oh, I only want so-and-so to sync, but not these people. The out-of-the-box connector, unless you're on a higher level of Pardot, it's pretty black and white. It's anytime a leader contact is created in Salesforce to automatically create them in Pardot, or don't. This checkbox is what dictates that. So if this is checked, then any new leader contact will get created in Pardot as a prospect. Something that I recommend with all my clients is this campaign section here. If you have this checked, I strongly recommend creating a new campaign in Salesforce that's called something like Salesforce Connector or integration user, something that will distinctly attribute users, prospects rather, in Pardot from a source campaign perspective, says these people were not the result of an actual marketing campaign. These people's first touch campaign in Pardot is the connector user or is the Salesforce integration. That tells you that they came from Salesforce. That's something that I recommend when I'm to my clients. And I don't know that it'll be a question, but certainly something to know and keep in mind. And then there's here the other settings here around overwriting prospect opt-out fields. And what this means is when the overwrite prospect opted out field is enabled, an opted out prospect in Salesforce or Pardot is marked do not email in the next sync. And so I mean this is pretty consequential. So I would strongly recommend spending some time with this. If the do not email and prospect opted out are selected, opting that prospect in from Salesforce or Pardot deselects the do not email option on sync unless they've been hard bounced. So there's some real consequential stuff that happens here. If you were to select this overwrite opted out, I don't recommend it unless you have a very specific use case for it. It's not. It's out of the box. It's not selected. And the other thing here is if records do not have a CRM ID to match when syncing, use email address. This will this lets the connector user use an email address as a secondary prospect match criteria. So the connector will try to match records by the CRM ID first, and then it'll look for an email address if there is no CRM ID. This is toggled on by default, so I would recommend keeping it that way. But being familiar with the implications of this, of if there's a sync that's trying to happen between Pardot and Salesforce, and this person doesn't exist yet, for example, in Salesforce, there's no CRM ID, so it's going to look for an email address. This is what enables that to happen. If you don't want this to happen, then there's other things you need to keep in mind that I would recommend. But just being familiar with these different settings and what it does and doesn't do is very important. So now we're going to look at the connected campaign setup in the Salesforce connector. I consider this to be part of the technical setup. There may be others who are part of this bootcamp that may touch on this as well. But for the purposes of your technical setup, these are things to keep in mind. These 4 checkboxes on enabling connected campaigns and engagement history. This is very important if you're using engagement history dashboards in Salesforce. The other thing here is use Salesforce to manage all campaigns. This is kind of a hallmark of connected campaigns, and so if you are, if the intention is to actually manage the campaigns in Salesforce, then this box should be checked. There is an option to show unconnected campaigns in the Pardot Campaigns tab, and this is, there isn't really, I typically check this just to have visibility to anything that hasn't been synced or is not technically a Salesforce campaign. The thing down here at the bottom is actually very important, and I can see this being a question on the exam around connected campaigns and record types. So by default, it will Pardot and Salesforce will sync the master record type for campaigns. You do have the ability to toggle here, so you can select other campaigns. So if you have other campaign record types, let's say you have by product A record type, product B record type, product C record type in the campaigns. In this Pardot instance, you only want to see campaigns for product A and product C. So what this will do is by deselecting master and just selecting product A and product C, it will only expose product A and product C campaigns to Pardot and will be created and available and visible in Pardot. This gives you some flexibility if you have around product marketing and around specific products and campaigns that you manage out of Pardot versus those that you don't. There is another setting in here that I didn't include in the screenshot here, but there is also the setting to be able to, when you do turn on connected campaigns, and this is really good for campaigns that have, for Salesforce instances, for example, that have some age on them, and you have, let's say, a lot of campaigns over several years, you do have the ability to enable the setting in here where you only bring in campaigns that were created after a certain point in time, after a certain date. So anything created after that or before that does not come into Pardot, but anything from this date forward gets exposed to and gets created in Pardot. This is a great tool for those that are, let's say, if they have not enabled connected campaigns and now they're going to do it, and they've had Pardot for a while. This is a great newish feature that solves some problems. I mean, I remember early on with connected campaigns, when that wasn't available, turned on connected campaigns and it brought in every campaign over the last like 6 years. And that was a lot, and it was unnecessary. And it created a lot of noise when I was trying to just target on this one campaign in 2018. And it created a lot that I had to find and dig through. So if your client has a Salesforce instance that has been around for a while and they haven't done connected campaigns yet, I would encourage them to take advantage of that feature. And I would encourage you to be familiar with that feature in the campaigns section here. So the last item here on technical setup is around IP address. When you need to, so you're able to see your IP address for allow listing or whitelisting. This is something that you tend to, for clients, if they need to do internal reviews of emails that are going out, in order to prevent their emails from going to spam or from anything like that, you're going to want to make sure to send the right people, to share the sending IP address with the right people. And you can access that from any page in Pardot or from in the account information table. The second part of IPs is around shared IP versus dedicated IP. I would recommend having a very good, strong familiarity with the differences between the two, pros and cons. Most people are provisioned with their Pardot instance on a shared IP. Shared IP means that you are among several other Pardot users, Pardot customers that are using that IP to send email address out of. Most people, I would say, don't need or qualify for a dedicated IP. The dedicated IP it certainly sounds attractive. What it means is basically you are the only sender on that IP and you are solely responsible for the reputation of that IP. You're not finding yourself influenced or being affected by bad actors who are other companies that are not being as cautious as you around your email sending behavior. But the thing about a dedicated IP is that you really have to be sending a lot of email. Generally, excuse me. Generally, the threshold that I'm most familiar with is sending around 100,000 emails a month. That's generally like the high water mark. If you're sending less than that, I mean, there might be some, but the thing about sending email about dedicated IP is that you need to have high volume consistently. If you were to send 100,000 emails on, let's say, in January, and then you send 5,000 in February and 12,000 in March, and then 100,000 in April, that's not going to work for a dedicated IP because they're volume driven, and if you are a dedicated IP and you're not actually sending high volume of email, that actually can affect you negatively from a reputation perspective. The pros of having the dedicated IP is that obviously because you're sending a lot of email and you're responsible. You're the one that's sending the email out of it. But if you're not sending a lot, it becomes kind of a hard sell or it may not be worth the money because you have to keep it up. Because if you have these inconsistent sends, then even your Salesforce account rep may be like, I don't know that you should do this because you don't send enough email to warrant it. The other thing with a dedicated IP, if you were to go from a shared IP to a dedicated IP, you do have to do IP warming. So this is something that I can very much envision being on the consultant exam, is being familiar with how to warm up a cold IP, a dedicated IP. What are the IP warming techniques? What's the process of updating, of warming up an IP? How long should it take? Typically, I mean, people have different philosophies on this, but I typically hear and have experienced it's around 4 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks of progressive email sending over time. It could even be months, depending on. I mean, I've also heard it being months, so it could be weeks or months. But progressively sending more and more email to establish a reputation on that IP address. So recipients, like recipient servers, begin to recognize you, and you start to acquire some reputation. Because if you just suddenly start blasting email out from this IP address that you haven't warmed up, it's going to be very bad. You're going to get a lot of bounce email, it's just that you're basically going to trash that IP address that you've just paid for. So be familiar with the pros and cons of IP warming, who should and shouldn't be on a dedicated IP, and if you're not on if you don't need to be on a dedicated IP, familiar with the ways to keep your reputation clean. Good email sending technique versus potentially hazardous or things that may get you in trouble. Something else that, since we're talking about IPs and email volume, and some of you may have experienced, I've been on the receiving end of this before. I have clients that have been on the receiving end. Pardot is pretty aggressive when it comes to ensuring that their IPs are kept clean and have good reputations, because obviously they have a lot of clients on them. So they tend to go out and try to identify and kind of weed out or encourage better behavior of bad actors. If you have a large email send, so you've got several thousand people you're sending an email to, and the deliverability is under 90%, if that happens a couple times, Pardot will reach out to you and try to get a better understanding of what's happening and why your email is bouncing. Because there's the permission-based marketing policy that Pardot has that everyone has to agree to whenever they upload any data. And they will ask you, who are you emailing? Are they expecting email from you? And they'll ask for some proof of that. You'll have to kind of explain yourself. So keep that in mind. That's something that Pardot manages, is how your email delivery behavior and the deliverability rates are also very important, because that is one of the ways that Pardot manages the IPs as part of their shared IP program, to try and identify and weed out bad actors. And now we're going to look at usage governance and data access. So I've been told by several people that the most recent version of the Pardot Consultant exam features business units fairly heavily. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about business units in case you're unfamiliar. So what business units do is they control which records sync between Pardot and Salesforce. You are provisioned typically with a new business unit out of the box. Obviously, you see the 0 of 1. You can purchase additional business units from Salesforce depending on your need. Every business unit has a business unit administrator, and this user is then also provisioned with a corresponding Pardot user record, and are given the role of administrator. Each business unit has to have a unique administrator, and the administrator cannot be a user in another Pardot account. Here's kind of, excuse me, Pardot business units are very powerful, and how they operate here is they're basically kind of sub instances of Pardot. business units have a lot of their own data. They have kind of, so you could have a list in business unit A that's not in business unit B. The business units connect to a single Salesforce org, but each business unit is treated as its own partitioned Pardot database. Business units do not have a hierarchical relationship. So within each business unit, it has its own Salesforce connector, prospects, marketing assets, segmentation and automations, and setting and configuration. And this is a use case for this is going to be example of, let's say you've got a company that does business in both Canada and the United States, or has different divisions for EMEA, for Europe, and so each of these units have to exist independent of the other. And so you'd be able to toggle between these different business units. Each business unit has its own users, its own integration, its own prospects, its own assets, segmentations, automations, and config. And the connector is set up unique to that specific business unit. But it's all connected to the same Salesforce org. It's just different units of Pardot that are porting into Salesforce. To control the lead, contact, opportunity, and custom object syncing, you would use marketing data sharing. This is looking at kind of the sharing rules and how this works with the business unit. To control which users belong to a business unit, you would do profiles. You would select the profiles when configuring Salesforce user sync. And in terms of which connected campaigns sync to a business unit, campaign record types when you configure the connected campaigns, which is what we talked about earlier. So if you have business unit A, and business unit A is responsible for everything in the United States, then naming conventions are key here, and also record types. So you want to connect business unit A to all US campaigns. You would have a campaign record type called US or North America, and you would sync all North America campaigns to business unit A. Business unit B is Canada. So you would, when you're configuring connected campaigns, you would select Canada as the campaign record type to bring in to the campaigns for the Canada business unit. Something else that's really important is that a leader contact can only sync with one business unit. So you can't have somebody who's a prospect in business unit Canada and business unit US. You're not able to have one in both. To have a prospect in multiple business units, you need to create duplicate records that represent the same individual and sync each record with separate leads or contacts. That creates some duplication, and there are certainly use cases for it, but it introduces some potential hazards. Pardot and Salesforce have their own data authorization and sharing models, and connected campaigns can sync with only one business unit. So like I said, Canada campaign can sync with Canada, US campaign can sync with US business unit. It's very much a one-to-one relationship there. So that's really important. And you are able to toggle between your business units. So when you go into Pardot settings and you click on, you say, all right, I'm currently viewing the US, but I want to view Canada. You don't need to duplicate users so they can manage multiple business units. Users can now exist in more than one business unit, and they can switch between accounts. So you can't have prospects that are in both business units, but you can have users that are in both. So you can have someone who has responsibilities towards the US business unit, for example, and the Canada business unit. When you switch between Canada, these different business units, you are effectively switching between instances. And doing this BUs switching can be a good alternative to having to buy multiple Pardot licenses. There are definitely organizations where normally they'd have to buy a bunch of different Pardots and have Pardot Mexico, Pardot North America, Pardot EMEA, and they would have just mountains of licenses. this would enable them to have a single Pardot instance and have users able to log into just a single instance, and then and you can set it where somebody who logs into the United States does not have the ability to log into Canada. They only have the ability to use their specific business unit. These are all settings that can be done at the admin level. Something else to consider with business units, things that you really need to remember, is that assets and prospect activity cannot be moved between business units. So if you have a prospect and you have all their actions in Canada, you can't say, I need to move them to US. That's not possible. Pardot and Salesforce have their own data authorization and sharing models. BUs connect multiple business units to a single Salesforce org. All leads are a leader contact syncs to a prospect in a single BU, which means that you can't, like I said, you can't move. You can have lead A in BU A and B. It's very much a one-to-one relationship. There's a concept called marketing data sharing. I didn't really get into that here, but I would recommend looking into it. What it does is, at a high level, marketing data sharing is a setting in the connector that allows you to determine what assets, who comes in, who syncs between Pardot and Salesforce based on specific criteria. It's a more advanced Pardot setting. I'd recommend looking into it. Marketing data sharing. It can be a little. It's an imperfect implementation of a needed feature. So hopefully, I'm hoping that Salesforce updates it. But marketing data sharing allows you to route CRM records to the corresponding business unit. To prevent data conflicts, associate your Salesforce campaigns to a single business unit, where I recommended earlier. Having Canada campaigns go to the Canada business unit, US go to the US business unit. Tracker domains must be unique across your business unit. So you can't have a tracker domain that is in Canada, but also in the US business unit. You can set up business units to share email sending domains or use unique domains. So you can do the email sharing across it. Unfortunately, there's no way to guarantee that each business unit is on the same shared IP, because these are considered kind of sub instances of Salesforce. I imagine that it's kind of treated that way from a provisioning perspective for IP addresses, so they may be on different sending IPs. Business units support all features of Engage except for mobile features and plugins. And business units support Einstein, which includes lead scoring, behavior scoring, and campaign insights. All right. So that's kind of high level business unit stuff. If you are taking the exam soon, I would recommend digging into that. Business units are kind of somewhat more advanced Pardot instance, Pardot license feature. If you're on advanced or platinum or premium, one of the two, you'll have business units, or you can buy them if you're on plus, I believe. So the last part here is around data migration, things to consider. So this is something that I know has come up on exams in the past. I think it was on mine, around let's say you've got a client that's on Marketo and they are wanting to migrate to Pardot. Part of what you do as a consultant is managing that migration. And from a data perspective, there are things that you need to keep in mind. So when you are looking at the data migration, specifically like moving the prospects or contacts that they have in Marketo into Pardot, it's recommended that you kind of step back and you take stock of everything that you have. How much do you have and how much do you really need? That's an important question to ask the client. That you've got 100,000 prospects in here. Do you really need 100,000 prospects in Pardot? Or can we do some automations, build some lists, some automation rules to identify those that are actually active, or weed out those that you've sent a bunch of emails to but have never responded to anything you sent? That is a way to really be able to kind of draw a line and say, I only want to bring in people who have, of the 100,000, I only want to bring in people who are associated to opportunities and people who have been active, who have responded to email in the last 6 months. you can do an automation rule, who has opened an email. You can run automation rules or dynamic lists to segment those people and to say, all right, export all these people, and these are going to be the first people that enter the database. It's also really important to make sure that you have their opt-in information. So opt-in tends to be kind of a hard topic in marketing because it requires people to do something that they don't always do, which is say, yes, please send me email. So I would make sure that you have, if you do have opt-in information, that's part of the data that you're exporting. Make sure that it's represented on the import, that there's a field that you're mapping to in Pardot to ensure that they have actually opted in. Something else to consider when you are exporting people is to also make sure that you have your suppression lists. So anybody who has opted out or is do not email in the old database, don't leave them there. You need to export them out of your Marketo or whatever, and when you import them into Pardot, automatically set them to do not email. Because even though they've opted, because their opt-out carries across platforms. Just because they opted out in Marketo doesn't suddenly mean that they're not opted out in Pardot. Those email preferences have to carry. So if they're opted out or if they're hard bounced, all that information has to come into the new instance to prevent you from accidentally emailing somebody who's already told you that they don't want email. It's really important to make sure that you have these in here. You can either call them suppression lists or just at the very least the records from your previous instance. Those people have to be imported into the database and be represented as what they were in the other instance. That's very important. And the other thing here to consider, when you do have people that you're bringing in, I would recommend, if you have people that are maybe a little older in your database, from when they were created perspective, recommend running a data cleanse. So there are plenty of tools out there that exist. Neverbounce, Kickbox. There's several others that I'm sure I use. Those are just two that I've used most recently. Those will give you a report of people who are maybe their email isn't active anymore. So you're able to kind of remove them from your database. People who you've sent emails to but don't necessarily, but they may have moved on, different jobs or whatever, to prevent you from importing bad email addresses that are just going to bounce anyways. This will also give you a report to tell you if you have any emails that are considered spam traps. There are plenty of those out there that exist, and they're meant to basically send messages to the organizations that rate IP addresses, that rate senders. So if you're sending email to a spam trap, then you have acquired that email fraudulently or through improper means. These things will be flagged in these services. So when you do bring people in, recommend doing a data cleanse, just to make sure that you're bringing in good data. The other thing that's important is permission pass. This is you're in this new database, and let's say there's people that you haven't emailed in a little while. It's become kind of common practice to among the first emails you send is hey, you haven't interacted with us in a while. Are you still interested in receiving an email from us? Give them the option to opt out or change their preferences. Sending a permission pass will give you the ability to further kind of optimize your database and remove people who don't want to get email from you, because that improves your email sending metrics and your database cleanliness and quality. So that's super important, and I strongly recommend it. I recommend it to anybody, and that could very easily be something on an exam to ask how to kind of maintain that database. And the last thing here is run naming conventions. And so when you are bringing in data, or when you're bringing in lists from another automation tool, it's not a bad idea to make sure that there's something in the name that identifies it as being kind of an older list. Like this is from Marketo, or this is from whatever it was. So you're able to distinguish in your database in your instance. This is a list that was created and has attendees and people who are part of this list are from this other instance. So you have a sense when you're looking at your list saying, okay, this is older stuff, and you may want to go back and look at it and assess it and say, oh, is this still list criteria that's good? Having a sense of what is old and what is new in your database is, in my view, very important, because this gives you the ability to know what was migrated, what was part of this migration and what wasn't. And it's good also for those people who come in behind you, because they'll then know, okay, this list or this form or this landing page was from Marketo. This is an older, because everything is going to have the same create date. When you look in your database, when you look in your instance, you'll say everything is from this one day. But in reality, this landing page or this form or list or whatever was actually created 4 or 5 years ago. It was just brought in as part of the Marketo migration. So that, in my view, is very important and could certainly come up on the exam. So with that, that's really all I have. I want to thank you guys for listening in, and I see that there's been quite a few questions. I haven't had a chance to look at them. I can see them blinking up there. But Esha, you want to jump back in?
Thank you so much, Ben, for sharing your information with everybody. Now we can take our questions up. So,
Really,
should
that
we
was
start?
a bomb, Ben. And I can see in the chat that Trailblazers did really take this up. I have few questions, Ben. Would you be happy to take them up?
Sure.
Okay. So Emma had asked initially, like, I'd love to know what % of customers still haven't upgraded to Lightning. At my org, we have only ever had it. So talking of upgrading, change management, etc., hasn't been relevant. I wonder when it will come off the exam.
I mean, I have encountered. I mean, I had clients that were on Classic. When I say Classic, I mean Pardot Classic, and they'll have the Classic app in Pardot, in Lightning rather, but they won't actually be on Lightning. So that's certainly, and I mean, Pardot is definitely still making that available. They're just basically, because with what's coming, I think next month, with either next month or in March. Where with the identity licenses, those are, so people still have it and they're very accustomed to it. So it's definitely, but the actual migration from Classic to Lightning isn't that involved. It does look a little different. Really, the biggest changes are around navigation, around where things are, and then behind it is the new function. There's some new functionality that comes with being on the Lightning app. So I would say there's still probably a surprising amount of people that are still on Classic because either they haven't worked with a consultant that strongly urged them, or they just don't want to. They're very comfortable in it. Maybe they don't use Salesforce all that much. The marketing team doesn't really do any Salesforce. You'll be surprised the amount of marketing people who are just in Pardot. All they do is send emails. Anything that even comes close to Salesforce, they just contact their admin. They don't do much. So the idea of the marketing team being in Salesforce is actually kind of scary to some organizations that have a very kind of tight grip on access to the org, to Salesforce org. Even if they have a very limited license, they will kind of resist the idea of being in Lightning, and they're very happy in Classic.
Yeah, definitely. That's true. So the next question we'll take up is the biggest issue. It's asked by Brian. I'm not sure if it is a comment or any thoughts if you would like to put on. The biggest issue facing Pardot users today is the migration to single sign-on. Do you have any thoughts on it, Ben?
Well, the single sign-on is kind of what with the identity licenses, and so because there are plenty of organizations that still have logins for pi.pardot, and that's going to be a little bit of a process because it's going to require a Salesforce admin or someone like them to create all these users in Salesforce and to give them these identity licenses, and then train people on how to log in to Salesforce using their new Salesforce login. So that is going to be a challenge. It's going to be different. It's something that people have to kind of learn to deal with because, and Pardot's, that's just how it's going to be. The other side of it that people who I talk to who have expressed the most concern is because a lot of companies, a lot of organizations will they'll create Pardot only users just for the API connection. They'll use it for Zapier or for another tool, and that's how they connect Pardot to these third-party tools, and that's going away. And so there's going to be some disruption among companies that are trying to integrate, because instead of using the Pardot only and the Pardot API key, you now have to use it's just a different login process now. And so not every company is going to upgrade at the same time. Some will still won't accept this new login process. So that's, I would say, the biggest challenge, or one of the biggest challenges that I foresee, in that clients of mine are going to experience some heartburn, because it's going to be, because I imagine that that there are a lot of organizations that a lot of software, a lot of connectors, a lot of integration tools that won't maybe make the upgrade, or won't change their integration soon enough, and may leave some people a bit stranded trying to figure out how to integrate Pardot with these third-party tools. So that's something that definitely needs some study. I need to spend a little more time with it personally, because I know that it's coming, and I'm familiar with, I understand how the identity licenses work and how that works from an SSO perspective, but from an API perspective, being of instead of connecting to this Pardot only user using a traditional login, now you're running through Salesforce, which is a little bit different. So that's my biggest concern, and the thing that's more worrying to me. For users, it's just going to be learning how to, like, because they want to actually, it's funny, the SSO for Salesforce, they want to actually have access to Salesforce, like, properly. Like, the identity license is like nothing. It's literally just for SSO. So they'll have a Salesforce login, but it won't actually really give them much access to Salesforce. It's really just going to be so they can log into pi.pardot, to the classic app.
Yeah, definitely. With like classic, I think it adds some more light there, right? So we have one more question by Pedro, wherein he's saying that, is it true that Pardot campaigns will be discontinued with connected campaigns? Like, there is no reason to use Pardot campaigns other than getting the tracking code. Any reason by tracking code is not in Salesforce campaigns? Any reason to use Pardot campaigns independently?
Hey, Pedro. So I don't know. I mean, Pardot campaigns, like I showed you guys earlier, that's something that is available, that you really have, that basically just for accessing the tracking code. If you set up connected campaigns and you make it so that Salesforce controls the campaigns, then the Pardot only campaign, I mean, you can certainly, if you don't set that up, you can still create Pardot campaigns that are not connected to Salesforce. If you need Pardot campaigns that just exist just for whatever you need in Pardot, then you can do that. I haven't heard it being discontinued. I will need to look into that, but but to your second question, really kind of where the value is the connected campaigns function. So, but if you don't need all the data passing between Pardot and Salesforce, and you only want the standard Pardot campaigns experience, then yeah, I mean, you should be able to. But no, there really isn't any other reason to use Pardot campaigns independently of connected campaigns, just because there's so much that you gain out of the Pardot connected campaigns experience. But right now, really, like the most functional part of it, other than being able to go into Pardot and see, like when you go into reporting, you can still go in reporting campaigns and see all your Pardot information there, like all your Pardot related assets and prospects. You can still see that. But there isn't really, but other than that, it's just really like the tracking code. That's like the main thing.
Yeah, true. So there's one more question by Brian is, do you have a configuration checklist you go through for the points you're sharing with us today?
Maybe I do. I'll have to look. If I do,
you can definitely add them in the slide deck.
Yeah, I'll definitely add it.
Yeah, I think that would help. So next we have, do we need to set up the email domain if only we have one brand and one domain?
Yes, you have to set up an email domain regardless. So to be able to actually send an email out of Pardot, you have to configure an email domain, and you have to configure, and you don't have to configure a tracking domain. I strongly recommend it though, because what will happen is if you don't configure a tracking domain and you start and you send email, for example, all the links on your email will just be go.pardot.com. Your brand won't be there at all from a link perspective. All your assets will just be go.pardot.com. Nothing will actually say go.yourcompany.com or whatever the subdomain is. So yes, if you're just going to send email, period, you need to create one domain to send email and one domain to for tracking.
Definitely, personalization is always icing on the cake, right?
Yep.
So one more question. We'll just take two more questions, or 2 or 3 more questions. Is there a checklist of limitations to configurations? Are limits important for the exam?
I don't know of a checklist specific to the exam. I just would recommend trying to. I would spend time with the technical setup. The technical setup documentation. I used it quite a bit for this exam just to make sure that I was clear about what should be in this presentation. So there is documentation out there. Actually, here, I'll include it in the chat for those who are interested. This is a good step-by-step for the technical setup. Things to consider. There's a lot of good information here, and it's brand new for this year, for 21. So I would recommend it.
Okay, I think that would be helpful for more people out there. Yeah. So what permission is required in order to be able to view the user sync page? Asked by Shirley.
What permission is required to view the user sync page? So that should be that's usually going to be admin. That should be admin. I don't think that's going to. I don't think marketing user can see it. I could be wrong, but I suspect that that's just going to be. Well, we can look actually real quick, because I am in my Pardot instance. All right, so admin obviously can. Marketing. No, so marketing can't. Marketing can only view users. So really, they have to be admin to be able to see that, to be able to do user sync.
Okay, I think this gives me a more idea. So what all permissions we want to see for various other rules out there in the Pardot, right?
I'm
And
sorry, can you say that again?
I think this gives a better, more better idea. Like if anybody's having more questions about the access and stuff or various other rules out there, so your hands-on demo was quite useful, I believe. One more question by Sumit: how do we share data across business units? What kind of data we can share?
Across business units, you can't really share any data across business units. You can share because it's very much like a one-to-one. So like every business unit has its own like landing pages, links, prospects, config. Consider them separate. Think of them as kind of being separate instances of Pardot. There really isn't a lot of sharing back and forth between them.
Good. So we'll just take one last question for the day. That could you please talk more about enabling person accounts, the pros and cons, and is it absolutely necessary to enable if you use person accounts in your Salesforce org, but still also use leads?
So this is a bigger topic. I can at a high level. So person accounts are kind of can be tricky. Not every organization uses them or needs them. Person accounts can sync with Pardot. Pros and cons is an absolutely necessary to enable. If you use person accounts in your Salesforce org, but still use leads, yes, you would want to enable person accounts in Pardot because, for example, person accounts are if you want, because there will be leads and person accounts typically. Those are not going to be the same thing. So if you're not marketing to person accounts, if you're not emailing people who are person accounts in your instance of Salesforce, if they don't need to be messaged or anything to that effect in Pardot, then no, you don't need to configure person accounts. But if person accounts are part of your marketing strategy and part of your outreach plan, then yes, absolutely, you do need to configure person accounts. Person accounts can be a little tricky. It used to be that you had to contact support for them to be able to enable it. Now you just need to make sure that you have person accounts enabled in Salesforce. And then once you do, you can then just do a single, it's kind of self-service. You just click the box and person accounts become available. And then there are some funny things with person accounts that need to be studied to really before you enable it. I don't know if we have enough time for me to go into that now, but the short answer is yes. If you are marketing to people who are person accounts in Salesforce, and you want to be able to email them in Pardot, then yes, it has to be enabled. If you are not, then no. The other thing with person accounts, real quickly, is that person accounts, when you are creating from a conversion point. So if someone fills out a form, becomes a prospect, and then needs to get pushed into Salesforce, if you are still using leads, then Pardot will create them as a lead. And then when you convert them from a lead, instead of converting them to a contact, you'll convert them to a person account. Then that person account will then sync back to Pardot as a person account. And they'll be in Pardot as a prospect, but also in Pardot as an account. So when you look at a person account record in Pardot, you see the name. The account is also the name because they're an account. But if you don't use leads, then what would happen is basically Pardot would, instead of creating leads, Pardot would create person accounts in Salesforce. So those are things to keep in mind and to think about. Yeah.
Okay, that was cool, Ben. So
Yes,
I think
Ashish is right.
Very, very informative, and a lot of best practices were shared by you. And if you see the chat, I can see Trailblazers are really enjoying this session. It was so much fun. That's not only my words, those are the words by Trailblazers out there. So thank you so much, Ben, for coming up, sparing your time with us. And thank you all the Trailblazers out there. Thanks for joining in and being an awesome audience out there. Stay tuned for day 3 tomorrow at the same time. and stay safe. Have a great day. Thanks again, Ben. Have a great day.
Yep. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of your evening, and good luck on the rest of these sessions. And thank you everybody for joining.